Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 22. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service, as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. He that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. Father, we ask for your help this afternoon as we preach your word. May you bless the preaching of your word. Empower us. In Jesus' name, amen. So, this is the next step after dealing with the family. And, of course, Paul's writing this to the Colossians, and this is the practical outflow of Christians being separated from this present world. You know, in Galatians, he talked about being separated through the sacrifice of the Lord from this present world, but that does work itself out in what we do and how we live and how we think and our attitudes. It's very practical, but it's something that God is working in us. And so he started with the outflow of the graces of the Spirit start in the family. They start in the home. They start with the wife submitting herself to her own husband, the husbands loving their wives, children obeying their parents, fathers not provoking children to wrath. And then the very next logical extension of that thought is who we work for. And so it'll carry over into that. So how you live in the home, because in the home is where you're at, it's who you are, that's going to permeate every other aspect of your walk here, your existence here. And of course, he begins by talking about servants. And it's interesting that Paul, when dealing with servants, in this sense, they're not paid servants, they're slaves. And we've mentioned it before, but slaves were a very common occurrence in the Roman Empire. In fact, they've been common pretty much all down through history. There is slavery today. And it wasn't only something that the whites did to the blacks, you know, in the 17 and 1800s and the 1600s in the New World. It's occurred on every continent, and people enslave each other regardless of what color they are. And they enslave people who are the same color as they are. It's just been a part of life. And I think we get an insight into God's view of slavery when we look at Philemon. Elijah preached on Philemon earlier in the year before Nate was doing Sunday school. And Paul talked about Onesimus, who was a slave, becoming a son. And that really is how it all was for us as believers. Before we were saved, we were all enslaved to sin. So we were slaves, whether we were physical slaves or not. We were in spiritual bondage. And the Lord freed us and adopted us into his family. We became sons. But in saying all that, Paul never advocates for any sort of rebellion on the part of the servants. And remember that he's talking to Christian servants now. And so even in the situation that they were in, they were to act like Christians were to act. Now, we could, instead of saying servants and masters, we could say employees and employers. And we're being paid. They were servants and they were slaves. So they were the people themselves were the actual property of their owners. And it is true that servitude was a very common practice in the Roman Empire, and servants could lose their lives for not obeying their masters. So they probably, generally speaking, did the outward anyway, and because they didn't want to die. but they could do it with the wrong attitude, right? So they could serve, but they could serve with a poor attitude. But here, Paul deals with the attitude. He deals with the heart. And that's what it's all about, right? So these graces of the Spirit that a saved person is to exhibit are something that flow out of him, not that he generates for himself. It's something that God's doing a work in our hearts. It's a result of God doing a work in our hearts. And it even applies to our relationships outside of the home, and it applies to in our case, the employee-employer relationship. And so he says here, servants, obey in all things. So these are direct commands to servants. And this has to do as much with the outward obedience as we read through this and study this as it does with the attitude of the servant in doing what he does. I don't know who it was, whether it was Elijah, maybe it was this morning, or maybe Nate, or something I was reading, or whatever it is. I don't remember. It's just recently, though, we were talking about, or somebody was talking about, you can obey outwardly, but you could not be obedient in your heart and in your mind. And very often, that's the way children are, right? So they'll go and do what they do, but they do it because they feel like they have to, but they don't do it with a good attitude, right? And so that's something we try to teach our kids. It's like you not only have to obey, but you have to obey with the right attitude. Okay? So if I tell Hannah to sweep the floor, and she looks at me, and she goes and gets the broom, but she's looking at me like this, and she's sweeping. Even if she does a good job, she's not really being obedient. That's not obedience, because obedience is from the heart. So it's an outward compliance, okay, but it's not obedience. And obedience is something that comes from within, true obedience. And, of course, ultimately, the obedience is to the Lord, and that's what it's all about. So he says, obey your servants in all things, so they're to comply fully in every respect, in every regard. And, again, just in case anyone says, well, you mean if they ask us to do something illegal or unlawful? No. Now, I don't know then, perhaps, I mean, even if they asked them to lie or whatever or do something evil, they probably would have had to say, all right, I'm going to have to suffer for this, and say no. But in our case, obviously, it's not, if they're not, and in their case, it's not asking us to do something. Paul's not saying if they ask you to do something morally wrong, breaking God's law. If your employer asks you to steal, or if they ask you to lie, or if they ask you to do something that would endanger your life, right? Then absolutely you shouldn't do that. But in every other area, you should be obedient to the best of your ability. Obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. So he's talking to servants about masters who may not be saved. Okay? Because obviously there would be Christian servants who had masters who didn't know the Lord, didn't care about the Lord. And that's not dissimilar from where I believe it's Peter talks about the wife obeying the lost husband, right? And all other, it's the only place in the Bible where it's mentioned that someone can be saved without the outward, preaching of the Word of God, because God, in the interest of maintaining that correct family order, that's where the wife remains silent and her husband can see her good testimony. So, and it's talking about obviously a lost husband, which doesn't negate the marriage relationship, right? So just because you're a servant or an employee and you're saved, that doesn't negate the relationship you have with your employer. So, and in fact, it elevates your responsibility as a believer, because I am sure that there are some servants who, once they got saved and recognized that in the eyes of God, of course, they would have recognized that they were in bondage to sin, and they recognized that they now had liberty, right? They were now free, and that they were now sons of God on an equal footing with their masters, regardless of whether they were saved or not, that they would have thought, well, God has freed me from this obligation. And that is not what the case was at all, right? In fact, the obligation for them was even greater to be obedient to their masters than it was before, because they were Christians. And that would be hard. That would be a hard pill to swallow. If you're a slave, a bought and paid for slave, and you have this preacher, this apostle telling you that, no, you can't run away, you can't go out, and part of your liberty is that you willingly stay and obey your master in everything. How does that make any sense, right? So, in everything doesn't mean unlawful or immoral. Then we have a duty to a higher master. But even if they ask something that's inconvenient or hard, not immoral, but inconvenient or hard, you're obligated to obey. Right? And who knows but that a Christian employee who cheerfully obeys his employer might not win them to Christ through his good testimony. And the converse is also true. If a Christian employee is rebellious and lazy, what will the employer think of Christianity? So that to comply, to be cognizant or aware of who we really serve. Paul says in the flesh, we're to obey them even in the difficult things, recognizing that as Christians, while we're serving them in the flesh, here, physically, in this present world, we're really serving the Lord. So even at work, though you're an employee, you're still serving the Lord. Right? You're still serving the Lord. And that's the issue, because we might think, well, God doesn't care because it's an unequal or unbalanced situation. But God does care, absolutely. He cares about how you treat your employer. And he says, not with eye service as men pleasers. So that gets back to that outward aspect of it, that facade as opposed to what comes from the heart. You're not to do what you do. And this applies across the board for the Christian generally. We aren't to do what we do as a show for one another. Like if you're just coming in here and acting a certain way just so everyone here thinks that you're a good Christian, well, that's obviously that's not the right way to go about it, right? Or if you come in here and you act a certain way because you want the pastor to think a certain way about you, right? That's not the right way to go about it. That's the wrong motivation. And even at work, I mean, there's any number of reasons we could list as things that would be a motivation. Like maybe you want them to think, and you should want them to think, that you're a good worker, or or you want to get promoted, or you want to make more money, or whatever the case is, right? So you do what you do to attain those goals. I mean, you should want your employer should think you're a good worker, right? They should have a trust in you. But here we're talking about the employee and his motivation. What motivates you as an employee? Well, it's the same thing that should motivate a wife to submit herself to her husband, or for a husband to love his wife, or for children to obey their parents, or for fathers not to provoke their children to wrath, because we're doing it for the Lord ultimately. And so your service to your employer it's more actually service to God than it is to your employer. So as you're yielding to your employer, you're really yielding yourself to your God. And that's exactly what he says. Not with eye service as men pleasers. So we don't want to be men pleasers. We're not doing it as an outward show to get accolades or to achieve ends, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. In other words, we're doing it for the Lord. He is the one we're striving to please. He is the one that we should fear. He's the one that we desire approval from. And he approves of all those things. He approves of you working hard and being a good employee, right? He approves of that, right? And being obedient. But that's why you have to do it. You're seeking God's approval. And that's the reason. Fearing God. So, we're to, the idea of singleness of heart there, it means to serve. We're focused on the job, right? We're focused on why. So we serve our employers rightly. We do a good job. We don't steal. We don't steal time, knowing that our Master in heaven is always watching us, and he's the one we've got to answer to, right? And again, that idea of fearfully serve, it's not looking over our shoulder, but it's with that respect, that's eye towards pleasing God. And when you start worrying, by the way, about what other people think, you're never going to do the right thing anyways. So you should always keep your eye on the Lord. And then we heartily serve. He says, and whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men. But that presupposes that you are doing things heartily as unto the Lord. And heartily means with vitality, with gusto, and all these things we've talked about before. It means taking the initiative and doing things that need to be done. Right? And you think about what type of employee you are, if you're an employee, and think about, your attitude towards your employer and your attitude towards your employer relative to the Lord. And how do you serve your employer or work? Well, I don't want to use the word serve because, that offends people, right? But what kind of employer are you? How do you work for your employer? Do you work heartily? Do you do it heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men? Because that's ultimately what it boils down to. And this is ultimately the reason. And so it's sincerely, fearfully, heartily, and knowingly serve, verse 24, knowing that. So this is something we are aware of, and we should be aware of, and we should maintain an awareness of. We should keep this in the back of our minds, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance. So we're going to be judged as believers, not for our sin. We're not condemned for our sin. We spoke of that this morning. But we are going to be judged. We're going to stand at the judgment seat of Christ, and we're going to be judged for our works as believers, not for salvation, but for reward. And we are going to stand before him, and so we keep this in the back of our mind. And so what you do here as a believer is going to be rewarded or not, right? And so if you go through this life and you're not a good employee, that's not going to work out too well for you. And it says that in the very next verse. Now this is a general precept, verse 25. So verse 24, we know that, and this is the point, God's going to reward you even if you're not rewarded here, even if your employer doesn't reward you. That if you do what you do for your employer, even if you're not rewarded by him or her or whatever, but you're doing what you do as unto the Lord's going to reward you. He's going to take care of you. He's going to make it worthwhile. And of course, remember, this is all an issue of faith. This is all about faith. Do you believe that God's going to take care of you if you do what's right by your employer? Even if your employer doesn't do right by you. You know, that would be a faith thing, right? Paul wants us to know that God's keeping track and that he will reward those accordingly that don't do what's right for their masters also. Verse 25, he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done. And now that's both here and now, right? I mean, if you're not a good employee as a believer, then you shouldn't expect to be treated like a good employee. And of course, this is similar to what Peter says. If you're treated badly for doing right, okay? But if you're treated badly for doing wrong, you really don't have any complaints. You know? Don't complain when you don't do what's right and you're not treated like you're some sort of stellar, you know, and if you know, you don't have anyone to blame, right? And that's what Paul's saying here. So God's keeping track. You're serving the Lord Christ. He is your master. You're serving him. He's number one. And even when you're working from, I'm not saying, and by the way, I'm not saying you can't look for another job or whatever the case is, but when you're actually working for a person, when you're working for a company or a person, whatever, an employer, while you're working for them, you should give them the very best of who you are, right? And if you don't like what they're doing, you should still give them the very best of who you are. And if you don't like it, do something else. You know, I mean, what I don't know what else to say in that situation, right? But don't say, well, they're not treating me right, so I'm not going to treat them right. That is unchristian. Okay? That's not Christian. And so it's important that we remember that we're serving the Lord Christ. And it's interesting that he calls him the Lord Christ there. He's the Lord. And we really, well, we may not consider ourselves slaves or servants of other men today. We're definitely his servant, if you're saved here today. He's in charge. We are his bond slave. Okay. And so he says it here. God's not there's no respect. God's not a respecter of persons. One thing you can say about the Lord, when a person, God will save the rich. He'll save the poor. He'll save the weak. He'll save the strong. He'll save the smart, and he'll save the stupid. Right? I mean, look at me. Right? Pretty dumb, but Lord save me. And he's not a respecter of persons when it comes to salvation. But there's definitely within salvation, though, it's we talked about the merit-based system, right? And basically that's what the Lord's saying. Hey, if you're saved and you don't do right, don't expect diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know what I'm saying? Don't expect just to get the job just because. Or don't expect that you're not going to suffer for doing wrong because you are a Christian. And remember, he's talking to slaves now, servants. So he says, just because you think you're saved, just because you think salvation gives you some sort of exemption from being obedient to your masters, you're wrong. If you do wrong as slaves, even as believing slaves, you're going to pay the price. And that's just the way it is. And expect it. Expect it. You're getting what you deserve. And so we don't use that as an excuse for doing wrong, right? So Paul still expected them to do what was right. Then begins to talk about believing masters. So now you've got the flip side of the coin. You've got believing masters. And of course, as a property owner, the masters, as we said earlier, the people they had as servants were property. And the tendency would be to look at them as merely property and not souls. I mean, if you have a slave, if you own another human being, you're not looking at them as honestly, when it gets down to it, you're not looking at them as a soul that's equal with you. You're looking at them as, a piece of property to be bought and sold. And again, we can make the correlation as an employer, right? And employers, maybe they've worked hard for what they have. I mean, you can't really be successful as a business person or as an entrepreneur unless you're willing to put in the effort and put in the time. I think of like restaurant people and stuff like that, and it's like, I wouldn't want to own a restaurant. I mean, that's just my personal opinion. I mean, it's just such a, I know they can be successful. Teresa she and Dana Mitchell worked together for Dana's aunt and uncle down in, what was the name of that town? In Panacea, Florida. And they opened a restaurant. And so Teresa and Dana were working for them, and I don't think were you doing all right, or were they expect you? They did. Let me put it to you like this. They weren't just waitresses. They were all, the husband and the wife, and Teresa and Dana, they were working really hard. And they had them doing everything. And some of the stuff they were doing, and they weren't getting paid minimum wage because they got tips, but they were doing things that normally an hourly employee would do. And they weren't getting paid tips for that. They only got tips for the waitressing portion of it. And it was hard work because they were opening a new business, a lot of hours, a lot of hard work. And I just thought, just listening to Teresa talk about it, I'm thinking, there is no way that I would want to start a restaurant, Some other businesses, but not a restaurant. And then all the customer service and all that other stuff. But there are people who are very successful at it, as they are in other businesses. But whatever business that it is, it requires a lot of effort. So someone might be thinking, you know what, I've worked hard. I have pulled myself up. I started from nothing, from scratch, and I have worked hard to achieve what it is that I have. And and maybe the idea is that, the employees are kind of expendable or whatever the case is, and you don't want to give them too much, and they're just employees, but you're it, that sort of thing. And that's where we have to be really careful as employers. A Christian employer can't have that attitude. It says here, now you don't expect this employees of non-Christian employers. Why would you expect an unsaved person to be wonderful? I worked for years for an unsaved man. The only thing that lit him up was when he made a buck. And he expected me. I've worked Christmas Day. I've worked Thanksgiving. I've worked all night trying to get a hotel open. And until I got married, I didn't take vacations. I worked 6 days a week. And he didn't care. All he cared about was money because, I had 1 year to get this hotel built. And after that 1 year was up, he was paying, depending on how much we had spent on the construction loan, about $15,000 in interest a day. He didn't care whether I worked Christmas or not. He didn't care and he was Chinese, he didn't like American holidays anyway. He didn't care. And I worked. I did what he asked me to do. And if I didn't like working for him, I could have just told him, hey, I'm going to go find another job. So, that's how it was. And so he wasn't what I would consider. I mean, he wasn't honest. He wasn't unpleasant to me, but he wasn't he wasn't a nice guy. He was a lost, rich, evil man who cared about making money, and that was it. And I worked for him as a Christian, and I could work for him as a Christian. The only thing I told him, I said, I will not lie for you, but I won't lie to you. But I won't lie for you. And, there were things that I wouldn't do. I said, unless it's an absolute emergency, I'm going to be working. I'm going to be at church on Sunday or whatever the case is. You know what I'm saying? But otherwise, man, I gave him a lot of time. But because he was my employer, and he expected a lot from us, from me, and I tried to the best of my ability to give him what he expected. And I tried to put myself in his shoes, man. If I was on the other foot, if I was on the other side of this, and it was going to be my wallet, and I was going to spend 15 grand or 20 grand a day in interest, I'd probably want my employees getting the job done too when we had that kind of deadline. And I wouldn't be too careful about whether they wanted a day off or not every now and again, But anyway. But on the other hand, as masters, as employers, we have to be just and right. So we shouldn't expect that sort of thing. I dealt with this up in Passadumkeag. There was a woman who owned a store in the town. She stayed open 7 days a week. I was like, how as a Christian employer can you have employees working for you on Sunday and then, be a good witness to them, right? And, you're going to be in church, but her whole deal is that she felt like she couldn't make it unless she was open on Sunday. And that's where you just have to trust the Lord, right? Just say, all right, Lord, this is your day, or and so we're gonna honor that day. And I will say this: you look at big stores, big companies that have done that, and I'm not saying Hobby Lobby is Christian; they purport to be Christian, but I believe God has honored. He's worth whatever. What's the name of that guy? Is that Cathay or is that Chick-fil-A? Yeah. But they both, at least they used to, Chick-fil-A used to be closed on Sunday. I believe God honored that, honored the principle. And they haven't been hurting. They've been expanding. And they do extremely well. So that would be an issue of faith. But give unto your servants that which is just and equal. In other words, do right by your servants. So we as employees expect unsaved masters, employers, not to treat us right. I mean, we want them to treat us right. I'm not saying you want them to treat you poorly. We want them to treat us right. But there's an expectation that they're not because they're lost. And that's not an excuse for us not to do what they ask us to do. And on the flip side of that, if we're a master, if you're an employer, you have to treat your employees the way you would expect to be treated, the way you would want to be treated, right? Just and equal. What's just and what's equal, right? In other words, you don't treat them like a slave, right? You treat them better. You treat them as someone who's, well, no different than you are. No different than you are. You see them as souls, not as slaves. You see them as souls, not as property. And so there's the expectation that the servant is going to do what he's told, and there's the expectation that the saved master or employer is going to do what's right by his people, right? He's not going to rule with rigor. He's going to be just, and he's going to be kind, and he's going to be fair. He's going to treat his people right so that his employees, or slaves in this case, who weren't saved could say, man, this is somebody I don't mind working for. Right? Think in the Old Testament when a slave would go out and they would get sent out, and if he wanted to remain a slave, maybe he had married while he was a slave and whatever, or he had children while he was under the roof, and it was very clear that if you came in single, and you were going to go out single, unless the master was gracious. But again, the burden was on the slave. So if a master was a good guy, I suppose he would have said, look, you're free, you take your family with you. Okay? And that would be, we would say that's the right thing to do. But the burden was on the slave. And if he went out and he didn't want to, if he loved his wife and he loved his children and he loved his master, he would become a bond slave. And there was a mark for that. And they would put their ear up against the door and they would run an awl through it. And that marked them for life as a bond slave. And actually, that's how we're represented to the Lord, by the way. That's how Paul represented himself, as bond slaves to God. We've been marked. Not physically, at least physically like that. But we're bond slaves to the Lord. And so the master had to recognize that he was, in fact, a bond slave to Christ, even though he was an owner of human property, and he had to treat them justly and equally. And Paul said as much to Philemon. He said, he's a slave, and he can come back to you, and he can be your property. But he said, I would that you treat him as a brother. Treat him as a friend, as a brother in Christ. Someone who is profitable to me and to you, as a brother, not as a slave. But it was something that Philemon had to do on his own. He had to come to that conclusion. And so, really, in a Christian, truly Christian society, slavery wouldn't have any footing, wouldn't gain any ground, right? If we were truly Christian, if Christians, and we were trying to serve the Lord and be just and right and equal, how can you be just and equal to your slave unless you make them free? That would be the ultimate thing. But we're not in a slave-servant-master relationship. We're an employee-employee relationship. To me, that's the very closest thing. So it's a different dynamic. So treating your employees justly and equally would be treating them essentially the way you would want to be treated. How do you want to be treated as an employee? You think about it. You want to be treated right. You want to be treated well. You want to be treated fairly. You want to be treated honestly, right? Isn't that how we all want to be treated? And so if you want to be treated like that, you think about if you're on the flip side of that, if you're the master or if you're the employer, and how you would treat your employees. Obviously, an employer is in it to make a profit. But I would say this, that if you as a Christian employer were treating people the way as unto the Lord, so it's as unto the Lord, you're serving the Lord, God's going to bless you. He's going to bless you. He's going to bless that attitude, and he's going to bless that way of thinking and that way of doing things. Because that's what he says here. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. In other words, you're a slave too. You're a slave of a higher master, a higher king. And he's treated us as friends, right? He's treated us as sons and brethren. He is our master. We are his slaves. And yet he treats us as sons of God. And he's given us the inheritance of sons of God. And so as an employer, we would think about that. Well, since the Lord treats me in such a gracious, good, and kind way, I'm going to treat my people in a good, gracious, and kind way. And so this essentially concludes this aspect of it. And it's very important. Is your home right? Do you manifest the graces of the Spirit, in your home as individual wife and husband and children, fathers? And at work, what is your relationship at work? And most of us, I think, here are employees, right? And so how do you what kind of employee are you? Do you serve your employer as a believer who is serving Christ first? Do you represent him well as a believer? Would they look at you and say, man, these Christians, maybe they're a little bit off in their thinking, but I can't fault them for their work ethic. I can't fault them for their honesty. I can't fault them for their integrity. I know they're going to get the job done. Right? And that's the way it should be. And maybe you win them over to the Lord.